Okay, folks, welcome to another session of PHI 240. Today, we're going to be looking at a wonderful paper by Susan Wolf called Moral Saints. So last time around, we looked at theories of the good life. In this paper, Susan Wolf makes the argument that there may well be more to a life well lived, the kinds of lives that we might hope to have for ourselves and the kinds of lives that we might admire, that there might be more to those lives than simply morality. So, let's get to it. Just so you know, Susan Wolf is a terrific philosopher, and she works at UNC Chapel Hill, just down the road from us. First two sentences of the paper. Here's what Wolf tells us. She says, "I don't know if there are any moral saints, but if there are, I'm glad that neither I, nor those about whom I care most, are among them." So the thought here, we'll have to spell out. But here's what St. Wolf means when she's talking about moral saints. So she says, a moral saint is a person whose every action is as morally good as possible, a person, that is, who is as morally worthy as can be. So it is impossible to do a better job than the job that is being done by a moral saint from the moral point of view. So we might think if morality is all about helping others, then the moral saint will help others as much as humanly possible and as much as practically possible for them in their situation. Now, there are a couple of different ways we might characterize the moral saint, right? So, in one sense, we might think of the moral saint as what Wolf calls the loving saint. So, a loving saint would be the person who is as morally good as they could possibly be, but they're the sort of person who genuinely desires the happiness of others in a way that most of us just do not desire our own happiness. So the thought here is that a loving saint has a rather different psychology than most of us, who are ordinary people with a lot of self-interested desires, right? Whereas you or I might find the idea of going to the movies a worthy activity for a Saturday evening. Wolf's loving saint might rather spend that time at the soup kitchen or collecting donations for Oxfam, something like that. So the loving saint has very different desires than us. We could also imagine what Wolf calls the rational saint. The rational saint is someone who desires the same kinds of things that you or I do. So this person desires to go to the movies on Saturday night or to spend money on a new pair of shoes, but knows and acts according to their knowledge that they could do more good by spending the evening working in a soup kitchen or donating their money to Oxfam instead of buying new shoes. Wolf is not saying that there's only one way to be a moral saint, so it's not that she's only thinking of, what Peter Singer has in mind in terms of getting as much wealth as you can to donate to the world's best famine relief charity. So, you might be a moral saint by helping the sick by devoting yourself to solving diseases, putting all those hours in at the lab trying to cure cancer. It might involve political campaigning or any other number of things. But the idea is that being as morally good as can be, whether that be as a loving saint or a rational saint, is definitely going to be about helping others, to help others out of their misery in a really extensive and thoroughgoing way. So now that we've got a picture of the loving saint and the rational saint, Wolff says it actually doesn't make sense to want to be a moral saint. That this is not a worthwhile goal to have. We can imagine, it seems like we admire people and we admire them for their non-moral qualities all the time. We admire someone like Michael Phelps for his athletic prowess, or LeBron James in a similar way. Or we might, admire someone like, John Prine, one of my favorite folk singers, who unfortunately just passed away. Or we might admire someone like Nicki Minaj for being a good rapper and for being really cool, right? So these are individuals that we admire, but it's not as if we admire them from a moral point of view. We don't think that someone like John Prine is doing more good for the world than, say, someone who devotes their life to famine relief. Although we do think that someone like John Prine, or again, someone like Nicki Minaj, are interesting and they're cool, right? But these are non-moral qualities that we're admiring. And Wolff even points out that being a moral saint is incompatible with a sarcastic or a cynical form of humor. So we might imagine a moral saint, the example that Wolff gives in her paper, and the paper is from 1981. So her example of a moral saint's favorite television show might be something like Father Knows Best. But the moral saint probably wouldn't enjoy a show to shows known back then, something like All in the Family. But you could imagine shows like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia or South Park not being the kinds of show that a moral saint would enjoy. The idea is that these sorts of shows have sort of a sarcastic or cynical way of looking at the world, and that moral saints just can't have that kind of outlook, especially if you agreed with the paper by Preston Roeder that we read the other week, which claimed that cynicism does seem to be a vice in a certain way. But it's also the case that a moral saint will not have a taste for gourmet cooking or fashion or the fine arts, things like sport or music or film. If you're a moral saint, if you're chiefly concerned with helping others in the world, you won't be able to have time to cultivate appreciation for these, I guess we would call them finer things. So here's how Wolff puts it. She says that if the moral saint is devoting all his time to feeding the hungry or helping the sick, then necessarily he is not reading Victorian novels or improving his backhand. Or, you might stick in any number of hobbies that we use to enhance our lives. So, they're not thinking about the next guitar to add to their guitar collection or learning how to play a better guitar solo, or again, focusing on their favorite sports team, or becoming a good actor, any of these things. But Wolff points out that a life in which none of these possible aspects of character, whether it be reading Victorian novels, or appreciating film, or music, or sport, well, a life with none of these things may seem to be a life that's strangely barren. We're saying it's like there would be something empty about that kind of life. Another way that Wolff puts it is that a moral saint will have to be very, very nice. It's important that he not be offensive. The worry is that, as a result, he will have to be dull-witted or humorless or bland. So you can't be sarcastic or cynical or resigned to the infirmities of humanity if you take this sort of saintly approach, Wolff claims. And it's for these sorts of reasons that Wolff thinks that, there would be something important that we would be leaving out if we tried to understand a perfect life as a morally perfect life. So, Wolff points out that her main criticisms here are just directed at common sense morality. And because I only asked you to read the first half of the paper, this is the main stuff that you needed to cover. I just want to flag a couple of points in the second half of the paper beyond what you read. So how would a utilitarian think about a moral saint? So remember, a moral saint is a person who is good as they can possibly be, as morally worthy as can be. And remember, utilitarianism is just about bringing about the greatest net amount of happiness over suffering. And Wolff points out that for utilitarianism, remember, it's a standard of rightness. It's not a guide for action. So it might be the case that, according to utilitarians, it might make us all better off if we didn't try to be perfect saints. Right? Trying to maximize happiness over suffering, in some cases, is actually going to thwart that very goal. And we might think that these extra things that add jazz or a lack of barrenness to your life is going to be justifiable from a utilitarian point of view. We don't want people to live barren lives, so we should have them play music, have them appreciate art, have them engage in sport. But Wolff helpfully points out that if you're a utilitarian, the way that you can enjoy these extracurricular activities, art, sport, friendships, it's simply not the way in which these aspects are to be enjoyed insofar as they figure into our less saintly ideals. The other way that she puts it is that this is sometimes called the one thought too many problem. The idea is you're supposed to care about art, not because it adds happiness to the world, but because there's something about the art itself that makes you happy. Bernard Williams is the philosopher who originated this one thought too many problem. He said, imagine your spouse is drowning in the sea. Now, one response you could have to that situation is you could simply rush out into the sea and save them. What you shouldn't do is stop and think to yourself, well, morality allows me to rush into the sea and save my spouse because the risks are this and the overall benefits are that, and I have a right to do so. The thought is, if you try to justify certain actions according to morality, that's one thought too many. Some things you should be able to do just for the sake of doing them. And if you're doing them because they're in service of maximizing pleasure over pain, that indicates a certain kind of shallowness of your commitment. That you wouldn't keep playing sport, or you wouldn't rush into the sea if you had any doubt that such activities were contributing to the happiness, the greatest overall happiness. So there's something wrong with the moral saintly approach when we think about utilitarianism. Now, how would Kantians think about being a moral saint? Well, one thing that we can recall about Kant, especially when we looked at Honora O'Neill's reading about famine relief, is this thought that you should always try to strive to be as morally good as possible. Because you'll recall that for O'Neill, we have an imperfect duty to further the ends of others as much as we can. So part of morality for Kant is furthering the ends of other rational agents. And if we're doing that as much as we can, then again, we are not going to have time to read Victorian novels or develop other interesting aspects of our character. But this leads to a lot of the same problems of sainthood that we've already had. It's going to indicate a certain kind of shallowness of commitment, and it means that actually succeeding in the Kantian project of furthering the ends of others would lead our lives to be strangely barren. So that's one way of thinking through Kant. But another way of thinking through Kant is to say that there might be an upper limit on how morally good you can be. So the thought here is that to be a moral saint is simply to not violate the categorical imperative. So that's going to mean simply don't act on maxims that are not universalizable, and don't treat others as mere means. And if you do those things, then you've acted in a way that is as morally good as can be. But Woolf has a really interesting objection to this point. She says that it's actually perfectly reasonable to strive to be like Jane Austen, so it's equally reasonable to be like that as compared to Mother Teresa. And let's say they do all of the basics of morality. They don't do actions that are ununiversalizable. They don't treat others as mere means. But Woolf points out that it would be absurd to say that Jane Austen and Mother Teresa, from the point of view of morality, are morally equal. So the idea of being a moral saint seems to be a concept that we shouldn't get rid of, or we shouldn't make the bar too low, right? We still want to leave room for supererogation, this idea of going above and beyond the call of morality. So here she's pointing out that if we're going to have a concept of moral sainthood, it can't just be meeting this upper limit on how morally good you need to be, because there do seem to be people like Mother Teresa who do seem to go above and beyond in their behavior as moral agents, and that when we prefer Jane Austen as a life to admire and to emulate, we're thinking in non-moral terms. So both of these Kantian approaches, one has the same problem as utilitarian approaches and common sense approaches. But the other one doesn't give moral saints as much credit as they deserve. So here are just a couple of takeaways from Wolff. Wolff is telling us that separate from moral values, there's a distinct class of non-moral value, and that these kinds of non-moral value are part of what makes our lives attractive and worth living. And in this vein, Wolff thinks that it's a mistake also to find a super theory. You might think that if we try to think about this conflict between moral values and non-moral values, we should be able to come up with a rule that tells us here's when you have to act according to the rules of morality, and here's when you have enough leeway so that you can pursue personal projects. But Wolff thinks that it's a mistake to look for this kind of super theory, or what she calls meta-morality, like a rule for which rules to follow. So we're not talking about meta-ethics here, which is, about what we're talking about when we talk about ethics. But in meta-morality, it's like rules for figuring out which rules to follow, whether they be moral rules or rules for good living and personal excellence. So it would be a mistake to think that, we can solve this tough question by simply coming up with a further super rule. So let's just finish up by looking at a paragraph here from Wolff. So she says that in pointing out the regrettable features and the necessary absence of some desirable features in a moral saint, I have not meant to condemn the moral saint or the person who aspires to become one. So she says, it's not necessarily something I'd hope for in myself or my loved ones, but I'm not saying that moral saints are jerks. Rather, she goes on, I have meant to insist that the ideal of moral sainthood should not be held as the standard against which any other ideal must be judged or justified, and that the posture we take in response to the recognition that our lives are not as morally good as they might be need not be defensive. So this is an interesting point that she's got here, because it suggests that if we think back to something like Peter Singer's case, where he says that we're doing something morally blameworthy, or at least morally questionable, when we spend our money on personal effects rather than, say, curing preventable diseases, maybe one way that we might go is we might say, yeah, we're not as morally good as we can be when we spend our money on movie tickets instead of feeding the hungry, but we don't need to be defensive about it. Okay, she goes on. It is misleading to insist that one is permitted to live a life in which the goals, relationships, activities, and interests that one pursues are not maximally morally good, for our lives are not so comprehensively subject to the requirement that we apply for permission, and our non-moral reasons for the goals we set for ourselves are not excuses, but rather maybe positive good reasons which do not exist, despite any reasons that might threaten to outweigh them. In other words, a person may be perfectly wonderful without being perfectly moral. So the idea here seems to be that, we don't have to apply for permission to develop certain traits in ourselves that make our lives worth living, such as appreciating a good work of literature or spending time with friends. That these are things that make ourselves wonderful as people and also make our lives wonderful. And it would be a mistake to think that these things are only worth appreciating or being glad about if they can be approved from the moral point of view. So, it's an interesting and subtle point that Woolf is making here. She's not saying that morality is a bad thing. It's just that we need to recognize its place within a variety of dimensions of value. So that's going to wrap it up for the philosophy today. Just keep in mind, next time, or for next week, we're going to be starting on our class voting topic. So we're going to spend 3 sessions talking about the ethics of the death penalty. So I'm going to post our final reading schedule on Moodle, as well as some deadlines for quizzes and your final argument summaries. So that's it for today. As always, thank you for listening in, and don't hesitate to get in touch if you have any questions or concerns. All right, take care. Bye.